Today, we're going to get deep into the numbers and look at my productivity from my 2023 season. Specifically, we're going to be looking at 8 flowers and looking at how many stems they generated from a square foot basis. So my name is Jessie. I live in zone 7A in New Jersey, and I just completed my 3rd year of flower farming. One of the resources that I really wish I had when I first started out was understanding how many stems of certain cut and come again flowers could produce for me while I was doing calculations to see if I wanted to make 25 bouquets a week, how many zinnia plants would I need? How many celosia plants would I need? And I would say that now, having had 3 seasons under my belt, I understand why that resource either doesn't exist, or if it does exist, should be taken with a giant grain of salt. And that's because the way that we grow, our climates, things that happen season by season that might vary, like pest pressure, you might get a drought one season, you might get a lot of rain another season, they're going to significantly impact that number, so much to the point that your numbers might look different from mine, but also my numbers might look different from year to year. But I think after 3 years now, and having grown some of these crops over and over, I feel a little bit more confident in putting these numbers out there. And so really what I want this video to be is a resource for people, for first year flower farmers, to be able to have some idea of how much output they could get on a square foot basis for certain crops, but also if you have been growing for at least a few years, to see how your numbers match with mine. And I would love to know in the comments below, because one of the things that this exercise revealed to me was that I had more attrition than I thought. I think of myself as a decent grower. I don't think of myself as a great grower. I mentioned that I'm going off my 4th year of flower farming. I didn't have any gardening experience before outside of some container planting for vegetables. So growing is something that I still need to improve upon, and these numbers really hammer that point home. So before we get started, a few housekeeping points so that we're all aligned on what I'm going to share. A square foot is 12 by 12 inches, at least in the United States. But the point is, I'm going to standardize every output metric, so that way we all know, hey, like tulips produce this amount per square foot versus Lysianthus, right? So that way we all have a frame of reference for comparison. The second thing is I'm using a general attrition benchmark of 20% to gauge how well I've grown something. So for example, if your attrition is 20%, that means for every 10 stems you grow, 2 stems will not make it to your market to be sold. And that's because that stem could either die from disease, it could show up too short. Point is that you're not going to get 100% success rate. And that's why when people crop plant, they're typically building in a 20% buffer. So I'm using that as kind of a guiding point to see, hey, if I planted 100 plugs in, did I get at least 80 of output, assuming those are one and done stems? Again, it becomes a little bit more complicated if they're cut and coming in. So I talked about how I'm going to share 8 crops with you in this video. If you want a bigger expanded list for my Patreon members, for the price of $5 a month, you can get access to a more comprehensive list where I talk about 15 crops. But I'm going to try to highlight 8 crops here that I feel most people are either familiar with or want to grow. All right. So let's get started. And I'm going to say that I'm going to go in priority order, meaning I'm going to go from highest to lowest, and you're going to see a pretty significant drop in numbers. So the first one is tulips. Tulips are actually, I don't know, honestly, if there is a more productive crop than tulips, because my yield was about 34 to 35 stems per square foot. And again, that's because we cran them in like egg carton style. So meaning the bulbs are just, they're almost about to touch each other, but they're not. They're packed very tightly together in some sort of hole, trench, whatever it is. And then they are able to grow for one season and we take them out. The reason why we're able to cram them so closely together is because we're treating them as an annual. Tulips are not going to be able to photosynthesize without their leaves. So when we take out the stem, typically the leaves are also coming out. And many of the tulips that we grow for cut flower production are not bred to be able to perennialize, with the exception of things like triumphs, Darwins, which you would potentially be able to perennialize. But point is that 34, 35 stems per square foot is a really, really high amount. However, I think tulips are a really great example of how productivity is not necessarily an indicator of profitability, because many of you who have grown tulips out there might have struggled with making money off of tulips. And that is primarily because you have other factors like cost. The bulb for tulips is definitely a lot higher than something that comes from seed or other bulbs that you might be able to perennialize. And then the other part is the price that you are able to fetch for that stem, which for tulips, sometimes people are underpricing because they're afraid to compete with something at the local grocery store or Walmart or Target, whatever it is. So for me, tulips have been profitable because I've been able to keep the cost down, maintain a reasonable price to charge for my florists as well as my retail customers while giving me a profit. All of that multiplied by a high volume, that's what makes tulips profitable for me. But again, today we're talking about productivity. Just wanted to bring in the profitability piece and the other factors to consider, without just thinking about, hey, like I need to focus on the most profitable or the most productive crops. So let's actually go to number 2 now, because you're going to see a drastic drop between that 34-35 stem yield. We're going to talk about Lisianthus. Lisianthus was my second most productive crop. It came in at 7 to 8 stems per square foot. And I'm going to say that there were a few things that surprised me about this number. One, I actually thought that number was a little low. And that's because I really cram in Lisianthus. I put 3 Lisianthus per Hortanova square. I know that I think a lot of people do 2 per Hortanova square. Each Hortanova square is it's 6 inches on each side. So I'm able to fit 3 into each Hortanova square. For the most part, I see people putting in 2. I've never really had an issue with 3. So hypothetically, if I'm putting in 3 per Hortanova square, that means I'm putting in 12 total plugs for a single square foot. And obviously, if you were to do 2, then that's the difference between 12 and having 8. So when you think about having 12 in the ground and having 20% attrition to be about 2.4 stems. So what that means is that I am still having more attrition than I should. I really should be getting close to 10 stems per square foot. But, it might be a factor of planting them a little bit more closely together. So if you're planting 2 per Hortanova square, I'd love to know what your numbers look like. Am I cramming them a little bit too much together? But I do know that for the most part, I have some stems that succumb to some fungal disease. Sometimes this is happening right before they're blooming. They look great and then their leaves start yellowing. I have some plugs that just don't establish properly because we're putting them out in late March when the weather is still fluctuating from basically winter weather to spring weather. So there's a lot of opportunity for things to go wrong, not to mention the fact that Lisianthus do stay in the ground for a longer period of time, which inherently means that you have more time for things to go wrong. So overall, I'm still happy with the 7 to 8 number. I just think I have room for improvement. And guess who's growing a lot of Lisianthus this upcoming season? I'm actually not growing a ton from a numbers perspective. I ordered about 6 trays, which each have a little bit over 100 plugs each. I'm just growing a lot more varieties than I did before because I just want to test them out. And so we'll have better data for next year. But what also surprised me about Lisianthus was when I start talking about some of the other crops, you're going to see how this number is significantly higher. And it made me rethink this question around just how profitable are Lisianthus? And I think the answer is that they're more profitable than I thought that they would be. Which might sound counterintuitive to some people, but I thought that the amount of time they spend in the ground would make them a little bit less profitable than certain other crops. So we're actually going to end this video with a little example of comparing Lisianthus to Cosmos. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that there. So number 3 is Celosia, which was really surprising to me that it made it all the way up here because I did self-sow some Celosia from like the Floret series, but for the most part, most of the Celosia that I sold was completely self-seeded from 2 years ago. So I'm still getting Celosia from my first season of flower farming. And so this is not unique to Celosia. Obviously, anything that self-seeds is going to be able to produce more flowers for you with less work because you don't need to put those transplants in or self-seed them yourself. But I felt that Celosia has a more superior end sellable product self-seeded than some of the other self-seeded flowers that I had. And so my yield for celosia was about 7 to 8 stems per square foot. Again, driven by self-seeding explosion of flowers, but also the fact that when there were some celosia plants that self-seeded in their own like remote island area, they produce really robust side shoots. And especially if they were interplanted next to a bushier plant, those side shoots really stretched up and got to the point where usually side shoots may be too thin of a stem or maybe unusable because they're curving. The ones that were interplanted next to a bush accidentally really stretched up to the point where that stem became long enough and straight enough to be used in a bouquet. So as a result, I had celosia all the way from, it was like July through basically like close to end of frost. And part of that was because every single time I pulled out a celosia plant, the way that I harvested was I didn't just cut it. I actually cut it all the way out because I'm trying to get rid of my cell-waste celosia. I'm trying to grow other types of celosia. A little bit more about that after, but ripped it out, and that allowed other seedlings to start emerging and really grow well. So it was almost like having built-in succession planting. Now, I mentioned cell-waste celosia. I have nothing against cell-waste celosia. I just think that there's so many different types of great celosia out there that it shouldn't just be limited to growing cell-way. And cell-way sells okay for us at the cooperative or wholesale, but it doesn't sell as well as certain other types like coxcomb or even flamingo feather. So I had some flamingo feather that also self-reseeded, and I had an issue getting those to germinate before, but when they're self-seeding, they're coming up by themselves. They're doing really well, and that is really highly productive because that has a lot of separate side shoots. So that meant was that celosia as a filler was a really profitable filler because it was almost no maintenance. It had a relatively long harvest window for me, not because it could stay in the ground with its bloom head for a long time, but because I had that inherent succession planting. Each time you're cutting a stem and you still have the central plant, it's going to regenerate a new shoot a few weeks later. So I also got additional stems that way. Again, you're going to offset the productivity of celosia by the fact that this is not a very high value crop. It obviously is not going to compare against a tulip or a lisianthus in this regard. But sometimes these supporting flowers, if you're using them in enough high volume and you can grow them quickly enough, can be just as profitable, if not more profitable, than certain of the other types of premium flowers that you're growing. All right, so the next one is the lily. Now, if you've been following me for a while, you'll know that I love lilies, and I grew so many lilies that it's impossible for me to treat them all as perennials. And so ultimately, I've treated some as annuals. And I would say that going into next season, with me pulling back on growing flowers, I'm not going to be growing any more lilies fresh. I'm just going to be using all the lilies that I've perennialized, which is still a few hundred. So I have plenty of lilies. But let's talk about yield here. So lily yield is different than tulip yield because we are perennializing lilies here. So lilies are 6 stems per square foot. That is a much smaller number than tulips, which is like 34, 35 stems. So we're also talking about different bulb sizes here. Typically the lily bulbs that I'm using are like a size 12, 14. Tulip bulbs are a size 11, 12. The lilies that I'm using, so bigger bulbs, are going to give me about like 2 to 3 bloom heads per bulb, which I find to be like a really good size. If we're talking about rose lilies, those bulbs tend to be a little bit bigger, but I'm still getting about 2 to 3 buds per stem, which I find to be like the optimal amount for bouquet making, because you would like, there are issues with having 6, 7 buds per stem in a bouquet, unless if you're doing like a straight up bouquet. It just starts overwhelming a mixed bouquet. All right, so perennializing lilies, which is why I need to give them a little bit more space, and that's why their yield is a little bit lower. But again, they are able to generate stems for you year after year. I think that if I grew them a little bit better, or if I had better timing, my yield could be 9 stems. And the reason is because the perennialized lilies that I got last year, some of them came from lilies that bloomed in the late summer of 2023. And what that meant was that those lilies didn't have enough time to regenerate through photosynthesis because it just got too cold and basically everything had died by the time frost came. So as a result, I think that I could increase that yield to 9 once all the lilies start blooming in the late spring, and then they have enough time to re-photosynthesize in the summer, go to rest over the winter, and then come back again. So I think that yield is actually going to go up for me. If you are succession planting lilies like annuals, you can have an abundance of lilies throughout basically the entire growing season. I took both the tulip workshop and the lily workshop. And so if you want to learn how to succession plant and force lilies, that's a good paid resource out there. But Linda d'Arco, who now really primarily runs her season off of perennial bulbs and forcing bulbs such as lilies, has said that she now is able to basically force lilies all year round, including the winter, because our winters are getting mild enough where part of the issue with lilies is that they can't tolerate the freezing cold temperature, especially once they're budded up. They're going to get like bruised. The winters are now mild enough where she's able to basically have lilies for like the entire year, which is kind of nuts. So if you have gaps in your season where you don't have a focal, definitely something for you to consider with a relatively good productivity yield. All right, so that was 4. The 5th one we are going to talk about is cosmos. So cosmos went from 0 to hero for me in 2024, grew them in year 1, didn't grow them well, didn't grow the right type, by the way. I grew a really short type of cosmos called zinnia. It just didn't occur to me that if it was in a cut flower section, it wouldn't be tall. I think zinnia came out to like 12, 14 inches. This year, I grew a cupcake blush and double click cosmos. They were super tall. I mean, here's a photo of me and Eric. I'm 5'3", Eric is 5'10". These cosmos are, I would say, like at least 4 foot tall. So let's talk about yield. Now, the yield for my cosmos was definitely lower than what I thought in my head it would be. It was only 4 to 5 stems per square foot. And if I had to guess what good looked like, it would probably be double that. It would probably be like 7 to 8 stems per square foot. So the reason why I had less cosmos than I should have had, because I had a lot that were unharvested, was because these cosmos grew really tall, which is great, but they were not netted, they were not corralled. So we did get some thunderstorms that came in and basically just wipe these cosmos and flatten them. And sometimes these flattened stems were still usable if I came out immediately after and, put them right side up. But if I even waited like 6-7 hours, they started bending a bit. So as a result, I lost a lot of cosmos from not having proper support. And I would say that I probably only harvested about, like a third of my cosmos. And that was primarily due to the fact that we were in the thick of my daughter's diagnosis process, and so obviously that took priority. I think I could have sold a lot more cosmos before that storm came, but totally fine. So cosmos are a really, really great example here of a crop that is really, really productive, low cost, but has a low price point in terms of how much you can fetch for it. So again, we're going to go back to that example of Lisianthus versus cosmos, and this is going to start making more sense to you once I play out that example. But what I love about cosmos is that you can succession plant them. They're really easy to succession plant because you can direct seed them, and as a result, I had cosmos from basically like July 4th all the way to the end of frost, and I had 3 succession plantings with them, all with the same 2 varieties. And the ones that I grew really, really well, you can see these next to the Lisianthus, like they don't even look like a cosmo, and they had fantastic vase life, because if you harvest them at the right time, you grow them well, you grow the right variety, you can have a staggered vase life of, I would say, around 5 days. Number 6 on the list is stock. So stock is one of those crops that I have been very stubborn on not giving up on, even though it's not an ideal crop to grow in my climate. I've seen plenty of growers in New Jersey grow them well, by the way, so it's just me. But I finally achieved fall stock last year. So I want to talk about what that yield looked like. So my yield was about 3 to 4 stems per square foot. I think that what good looks like is a little bit higher, about 4 to 5 stems per square foot. And one of the things about stock is that you can choose different types of varieties. Some are one and done, some are branching. So I chose Quartet, which is one that has branching side shoots. And I ended up treating all of my Quartet as one and done, because I found that if you didn't pinch them at the right time, they were not going to give you viable side shoots. They still gave you side shoots, but they were way too short to use. So if you were not there within like the 2, 3, I don't know, like within the week that you needed to pinch them, you're not going to get those usable stems. But it's totally fine because some of my stock stems look like regular stock that you would grow, like iron, cats, column, whatever it is, just a single straight one. Or what's the new one called? It's called stocks, actually. That one has really nice, long, fluffy stems if you can grow it well. But some of my other stems that had some side branching shoots coming out with budding flowers were a little bit more fan-like, and they made for really good filler in bouquet because it really made the perceived value of that arrangement look better. So I would say that stock is just one of those crops where it's tricky to grow, right? It may not be smart to warrant that space in your field if you have really limited space and you really need to produce a certain amount of flowers for bouquets. But I always believe in experimentation and growing stuff that you want, and to really push and challenge yourself to grow things that are tough to grow. So that might be something that you might want to put on your list. Plus, it smells amazing. Any bouquet that you put stock in, locally grown stock, just completely elevates that bouquet. And I think that that's just something that is not in productivity, cost of growing the flower, and the amount of money it could fetch. Like, yeah, scent might play into that last factor, but I just think that it creates a different level of experience having something that is beautifully scented, that is universally thought of as a beautiful scent. All right, so for number 7, we're going to talk about marigolds, which was a new crop for me this year. I was seeking a reliable workhorse focal to take me through the late summer into fall, and marigolds did not disappoint. My yield, however, was smaller than I expected, and it was 2 to 3 stems per square foot. And I know that that is not what good looks like. What good looks like, I think, is at least 4 to 6 stems per square feet. So one of the main lessons I learned from marigold was that if you want to have usable thinner stems in cut flower bouquets, you need to be pinching the middle. I did not pinch the central stem, and so as a result, I got these monster marigold stems where you had one central stem with a bud here, and that was like basically almost fully open. You had all these side shoots that were starting to put on buds, but definitely not there yet in terms of opening from the time that I was harvesting. So obviously, the easier answer would be I can just pinch this stem over here and then allow those to bloom. But if you did that earlier, then you can obviously get stems a bit earlier too. So I was still able to sell those wholesale. There's definitely a time and place for bulky marigolds, especially in things like installations. I just felt that the potential for them could have been a lot greater. And part of the other issue was that, again, I did not net or corral these. So by the time we had cut the first stem off, allowed the plant to basically regenerate more shoots, they didn't have as much space, having been intensively cropped, or they had too much space because they were first intensively cropped next to each other. So each flower or each plant was supporting the other. Once that central stem was cut, you lost some of that support. And so some of the slows just started flopping over, and that made for less usable stems. So I think the moral of the story is I need to be more on top of corralling and netting more, which I hate, but this is a great illustration of why it needs to be done. So I mentioned that marigolds carried me all the way from late summer through fall, and I did this through one tray of marigolds. The tray that I bought from Plugs came with some misseeded marigold, which played to my favor. I ordered a white marigold, and it came with another variety that was gold, and the gold one bloomed a little bit later. We're talking about like 2 to 3 weeks later than the white one. So that's how I got that staggered succession. I would say that marigolds as a whole, if you are able to strip the leaves off, they don't really have as much of a pungent smell as people think they do. They are a really good, productive, reliable focal, and should be something for you to consider alongside something like dahlias or whatever it is that you grow in the fall, because low cost in terms of production, high yield, and I would say that it's a middle of the road type of flower in terms of fetching from a price standpoint. All right, so the last one I'm going to talk about it's a flower that I actually need your input on in terms of numbers. So they're zinnias. Zinnias are a crop that I don't know if I love them and I don't know if I hate them. I know that I love certain types of zinnias. So I grew the floret varieties this year. I grew Golden Hour and Alpenglow as well as Unicorn. And Golden Hour, Alpenglow were amazing. My Unicorn was riddled with powdery mildew. And this is the problem with me and zinnias, is that I can't get a good enough crop out of them that really makes it worthy for me to grow them in a high amount. Now, I'm probably always going to have some sort of zinnia in my field just to like intercrop at something, but it wouldn't be a flower that I'm seriously thinking about relying on for consistent cut flower bouquets. And so my yield was only 2 zinnias per square foot. So what ended up happening was I got a great yield off of the first flush of both Alpenglow and Golden Hour. And as I'm waiting for that second flush to grow in with usable side stems, powdery mildew starts setting in. And I am just someone who is not going to wash off powdery mildew. Like once it comes onto the leaves, like I just don't want to touch it. So I will say that within the first flush, because I did this experiment of soaking some seeds in a fertilizer and some not, I got some very good usable side shoot stems. So this number accounts for the success of that experiment. So that number would have been lower had I not pre-soaked those seeds. I'd say from a really good plant, I was able to maybe get 2 to one plant. I got like 3 stems off of the first flush, but that was like an anomaly. The other plants, it was more like 1. And if I was lucky, I got another stem off of the second flush. So how do zinnias do for you? Like, what is your yield? Do you live in a place where you just don't get powdery mildew? The other thing that I hate about powdery mildew is that if you're not going to rip out your flowers that have it and you're going to let them sit, it basically becomes a patch of just white powdery mildew. And if you want to get rid of it, like that is not something you want to put in your compost. If you're tilling, that's not something you want to till back into the soil. So you're literally ripping it up, you're putting it in a garbage bag, and I'm actually wearing a mask or respirator when I'm doing this because I don't want the spores getting into my lungs. So all of those things make that just a crop that I'm going to think about again, or at least try to get better at growing and avoiding powdery mildew. All right, so now that we wrapped up talking about those 8 flowers, I want to go back to this example of Lisianthus versus Cosmos. So if you think about time in the ground, Lisianthus is going to stay in the ground, at least for me, for at least like 4 months. They get into the ground in late March and they don't bloom till like late July, sometimes even like August, depending on what group I'm growing. Now you take something like Cosmos, which not only I'm not transplanting in because I'm direct seeding, but it has a very, very low days to maturity. So we're talking about like 60 days to maturity from soup to nuts, meaning from the time the seed goes into the ground to the time that I'm getting a stem. Sometimes even shorter than that, right? So we're talking about like 120 days in the ground, or sorry, so April, May, June, July. So we're talking about 120 days in the ground-ish for Lisianthus, assuming you're buying from plugs, by the way. And then we're talking about 60 days in the ground for Cosmos. So in those 60 days that you have Cosmos in the ground, you can turn that bed again for a second bed of Cosmos, right? So let's assume that I'm growing 100 Lisianthus, and I was growing 100 Cosmos in the first accession. Now I'm able to grow 200 Cosmos, right? So now we've basically leveled the timing in the ground and adjusted for that. So now let's talk about cost. Lisianthus they're multiples more expensive to grow, both from seed and from plug, than Cosmos. I mean, I'm talking about a packet of seed of Cosmos is a few bucks, maybe $5, including shipping. And we're talking about a tray of Lisianthus. I just bought a tray of 110 for $80 without shipping. And if you want to buy from seed, they're usually like 20 something dollars a packet of 200 plus shipping, right? So you get the point. It's a lot more money. But I actually think that cost typically is, even though like it might be $80 a tray versus we'll call it like $30 a tray for the same amount of Cosmos, I actually think that that's a smaller amount. That's a penny wise, pound foolish type of number to look at here. I think productivity as well as the price that it will fetch in the market are much more important variables to look at. So let's talk about that pricing fetch in the market. Lisianthus, we're able to sell that wholesale for around like $2.50. Retail markup, you call it 1.5 times to 3 times that. Cosmos, most people are going to fetch around $1 for it. I was able to sell like $1.25, $1.35 for it because I grew them so well. The point is that over here, you have basically a 2 times multiple where I am for a Lisianthus to Cosmo. So I just said that I'm able to double the amount of cosmos I'm growing relative to Lisianthus because I can flip the bed twice or I can flip the bed once to grow 2 crops in the same amount of time growing 1 crop of Lisianthus. And now I'm saying that Lisianthus are selling for 2 times the amount of money as cosmos. Effectively, what I've said is that they are the same in terms of profitability. The one additional factor here to assume or to consider is demand. In other words, how many people are going to be wanting cosmos versus Lisianthus? For every type of flower, you're going to reach a ceiling. You're going to reach a ceiling in terms of just capping out the amount of flowers you can grow because there's just not enough people to want to buy them. Lisianthus has a much, much higher cap in my view than cosmos, especially if you're selling both retail and wholesale. Wholesalers or florist event designers love both cosmos and Lisianthus, but if you're selling to someone who's not doing event work, who's a florist, they probably would want the Lisianthus over the cosmos. So there's a lot of other things here to consider that go beyond just, hey, like how much can something produce? How quickly can I flip a bed? You also have to understand what the demand is for that crop in your area. A good example of this is something like yarrow, which I didn't put in this video. It's in the Patreon article, but I find that yarrow has different demand regionally from florists. Here, our florists love yarrow. I can sell practically every single stem of yarrow I grow. I know that that's not the case for other markets, such as like the Chicago market. There are a lot of flower farmers that grow it and can only sell retail, right? And this is why when you watch a video like this, you have to understand that what works for me may not work for you from a demand perspective. So I hope that this video was helpful for you as a resource as you are crop planning. In my last video, I talked about how it would be a 2-part series. My last video was actually about how you can get more out of a smaller grow space, and I teased up that this would be part 2. There's actually going to be a part 3 because I want to go into more examples of the ones that I did with Cosmos versus Lisianthus, and then I want to talk a little bit more about just the general output that I had from my field and really like how much I needed to use of my field at a given time to be able to grow a variety of flowers for my cut flower bouquet. So that will be coming up in an upcoming video, but in the meantime, here's an update on E.
Hey, what do you say? This whole town could be red by the end of the day. If you feel alright, we could throw it in drive. With the radio up so loud they can hear us from miles.